Please be seated, folks. When you come in, you can just come in and be seated. Okay, we're about to start here. I wanted to say one other thing about the trial process. Both the counsel and the defendants and the jury should try to avoid any indication as the evidence comes in of what you think about it at that time. And so we discourage people from nodding in agreement or shaking their heads in disagreement or making any indication of that nature as the evidence comes in. You'll hear a lot of things that you may think you agree with at the time, and you may disagree with them later, and it is sort of distracting, and also it's an inappropriate way for parties to try and influence the jury by indicating as evidence comes in that it's good stuff or bad stuff or whatever. So stone face, it's appropriate insofar as that's possible. All right, we will now commence with the opening statement with counsel for the plaintiff. And Ms. Lamoureux, you may proceed. Please give her your attention.
Good morning. My name is Yvonne Lamoureux, and I'm joined at counsel table by Sean Robinson with the U.S. Attorney's Office, Assistant United States Attorney Steve Scrocky, and FBI Special Agent Rick Sutherland. Together, we represent the United States in this case, United States of America versus Schaeffer Cox, Coleman Barney, and Lonnie Vernon. A fully automatic machine gun, a silencer attached to a pistol, numerous semi-automatic rifles, about 30,000 rounds of ammunition, 19 jars of tannerite, smokeless or black powder, 28 OC canisters, 8 CS canisters, 2 CS grenades attached to a ballistic vest, 17 grenade bodies, 4 smoke grenade fuses, 3 37mm launchers, and 4 Hornet's Nest rounds. You may not know what every one of those items are right now, but you will learn about them during the course of this trial. And those are some of the items that these defendants had on March 10th, 2011. And they were trying to get more weapons. This case is about why they had those weapons. And we're going to prove to you that they had them and were trying to get more, in part because they were preparing to kill officers and employees of the United States. Who are the defendants? Schaeffer Cox was the commander and leader of a militia, which he formed and named the Alaska Peacemakers Militia. Coleman Barney had the rank of major in his militia. And Lonnie Vernon had the rank of sergeant in his militia. The defendants were also involved with a number of other private groups in the Fairbanks area. You're going to learn about those groups during the course of this trial. They're groups related to the sovereign citizen movement. And you're going to learn that sovereign citizens in general are individuals who have varying degree challenge the authority of the state and federal government. Some of the groups that these defendants were involved with are the Alaska Assembly Post, the Second Amendment Task Force, and the Liberty Bell Network. And you'll learn more about those during the course of this trial. Schaeffer Cox had the opportunity to travel and did travel to the lower 48 to give public speeches about his militia. And in part because of the information that he included in those speeches, saying that his militia had grenade launchers and rocket launchers and machine guns. Law enforcement began an investigation in February 2010. Not because Schaeffer Cox was talking about his militia, but because of the items they potentially had and did have on March 10, 2011, and what they were going to do with those weapons. You will hear Schaeffer Cox, in his own words, say that they needed to be ready to kill. You're not going to hear the defendant say that this was going to happen tomorrow. But we're going to prove that that's what they were preparing for. Throughout the course of this trial, you're going to hear from a number of witnesses. Those will be law enforcement witnesses. Local, state, and federal law enforcement officers will testify regarding their roles in this investigation. For example, you'll hear that the defendants and their co-conspirators' houses and vehicles were searched on March 10, 2011, and law enforcement witnesses will testify about what they had. You'll also hear from law enforcement witnesses who interviewed the defendants when they were arrested. You're also going to hear from someone who can bring you inside, who can give you insight dating back to 2009, and that's one of the defendant's co-conspirators, Michael Anderson. You're also going to hear from a government informant, Gerald Olson, regarding the conversations he had and meetings he had with the defendants leading up to their arrest on March 10, 2011, as part of a law enforcement strategy. And you're also going to hear from a variety of experts. The items that the defendants had on March 10, 2011, I listed earlier, most of those items were in Coleman Barney's trailer. Those items were examined by experts with the FBI and the ATF, the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, Firearms, and Explosives. And they examined all those items, and they'll explain to you what they are and how they work. For example, an expert examined the 37mm launcher and the Hornet's Nest round. And you'll learn that the 37mm launcher can be loaded, attached onto a rifle, and that the Hornet's Nest round is an aluminum canister that's loaded with hard rubber pellets, and that can be loaded inside the launcher. We'll prove to you that those canisters can be lethal. It says so right on the label on the canister. You'll learn about OC and CS gas. They're similar to tear gas and pepper spray. Actually, you're going to hear Schaeffer Cox's own words say that those CS grenades, they won't kill you, but they'll make you wish you were dead. You'll hear from experts who examined the fully automatic machine gun and silencer that were in Coleman Barney's trailer on March 10, 2011. And experts will tell you that those, in fact, are what they are, fully automatic machine gun and a silencer. You'll hear from an expert who examined the grenade parts and pieces that were in Coleman Barney's trailer on March 10, 2011. And that expert will tell you he concluded that those grenade parts and pieces could be readily assembled into 4 functioning explosive grenades, and that they can be lethal. forgot to mention that the experts also concluded that those grenades and those 37mm launchers combined with the Hornet's Nest rounds are destructive devices as defined by law and thus required to be registered. None of these defendants had any firearms or destructive devices registered to them. You're also going to hear from a DNA expert, a fingerprint expert, and experts who examined the defendants and their co-conspirators' phones and computers. They'll testify about the information that the defendants and their co-conspirators had stored. You'll learn that the defendants had red phones and yellow phones, which they had marked so that they could try to avoid detection by law enforcement. You'll learn about the information stored on their iPhones and the text messages that they shared with each other. Why did the defendants want to kill anyone? We're going to prove to you that there were a number of motivating factors for the defendants. First, Schaeffer Cox had a number of interactions with state and federal officers and employees, and in most instances, he sought out those interactions with those officers and employees and got crosswise with them when they were just doing their jobs or they just happened to be in uniform. You'll also hear that Schaeffer Cox told people that he believed that there was a plot by the federal government to kill him and his family. And he also told people that he believed that the federal government was behind an effort with the State of Alaska Office of Children's Services to take his son away from him. We're going to prove to you that's all complete nonsense. Finally, the defendants shared similar beliefs. The defendants shared the belief that our current government was not operating under the rule of law, but instead was operating under the rule of force. And you'll see handwritten notes about that found in Coleman Barney's notebook. And you'll hear Schaeffer Cox and Coleman Barney in a meeting agree that if they were to shake hands and go roll judges' heads, they'd be morally justified. We're going to prove to you that this isn't just about some people sitting around discussing their views, voicing their anger and frustration with the government. We wouldn't be here today if that were the case. We're going to prove to you that the defendants were taking actions. They were preparing to act on those thoughts. And you're going to hear from someone from the inside, from someone who can give you that insight dating back to 2009, and that's one of their co-conspirators, Michael Anderson. Michael Anderson was a friend of Schaeffer Cox, and they shared similar beliefs. Michael Anderson also has an engineering background, and as you can imagine, is pretty good with computers. And he's someone who gained the trust of Schaeffer Cox. Law enforcement searched Michael Anderson's house and vehicle on March 10, 2011. And they found that Michael Anderson had written names of individuals that Schaeffer Cox had given to Michael Anderson. And he had information that he had gathered about those individuals for Schaeffer Cox. Now, in December of 2011, about 9 months after the defendants were arrested, Michael Anderson was granted immunity by the United States regarding the actions he took at Schaeffer Cox's request. And he's going to testify that back in 2009, Schaeffer Cox gave him names of individuals and asked him to start compiling information about them. Personal information. Where they live. What vehicles they drive. You're going to learn that Schaeffer Cox asked him to conduct surveillance. And together they discussed conducting surveillance at the Fairbanks courthouse. Michael Anderson is going to testify that he did compile that information for Schaeffer Cox, and Schaeffer Cox would periodically give him additional names to add to that list. Michael Anderson will testify that he even went so far as to conduct surveillance for Schaeffer Cox, even though Schaeffer Cox had threatened to murder at least one of those individuals. And the names that Schaeffer Cox gave to Michael Anderson were officers and employees of the state of Alaska and the United States. You're going to hear that both Schaeffer Cox and Lonnie Vernon reached out to Michael Anderson to get that information from him. But Michael Anderson didn't give it to them. He wiped his hard drives, he erased them, and then he physically smashed them to pieces. He was concerned, he was so concerned with the information that Schaeffer Cox, what Schaeffer Cox was going to do with that information. But Mr. Anderson forgot about the written notes. The notes he still had that law enforcement found in his house and in his vehicle on March 10th, 2011. And those names that were written down were State of Alaska Office of Children's Services employee Wendy Williams, Alaska State Troopers Ron Wall and Lawrence Piscoya, Transportation and Security Administration employees Trina Beauchamp and Tom Studler, and Department of Homeland Security Customs Law Enforcement Officer Nanette Curtis. Schaeffer Cox had also asked Michael Anderson to compile information about the United States Marshals. And on March 10th, 2011, Mr. Anderson still had written in his notebook on one page titled Federal Hit List. Underneath that was the name United States Marshal Jimmy Johnson. You're going to hear from some of these individuals. They're going to tell you about their interactions with Schaeffer Cox, and you're going to hear that none of them knew that they were on his list. For example, you'll hear from that Customs law enforcement officer, Nanette Curtis. She's going to tell you that she happened to be in a store one day in Fairbanks while in uniform and with her child. And Schaeffer Cox went up to her and started talking loudly at her about his views on the United States Constitution and the role of customs. Schaeffer Cox gave her name to Michael Anderson. You're also going to hear from TSA Officer Dawn Baptist. She's a canine handler, and she was in the Fairbanks Airport terminal with her dog and her partner. And Schaeffer Cox approached them and called them Nazis. She and her partner walked away from Schaeffer Cox, but Schaeffer Cox followed her out onto the curb. He got up close to her and he took her photo. And when she asked him what he was doing, he told her he needed to identify who all the Nazis were. Shortly after that, she saw TSA employee Tom Studler talking to Schaeffer Cox, the same Tom Studler whose name was given to Michael Anderson by Schaeffer Cox. So how did the defendants get caught? I referred earlier to the fact you're going to hear the defendant's own words. We're going to be able to play recordings for you during trial because a government informant, Gerald Olson, contacted Schaeffer Cox at the end of July 2010 and inquired about militia opportunities in the Fairbanks area. Mr. Olson consented to record his conversations with the defendants, and between July 30th, 2010 and March 10th, 2011, Mr. Olson recorded numerous phone conversations and meetings with the defendants, approximately 100 hours worth of recordings. Mr. Olson grew up in Montana, and when he was in Montana, he was involved with a militia. He and Schaeffer Cox shared a connection through a Montana militia member. FBI's direction, Mr. Olson reached out to that Montana militia member. And that Montana militia member told him to call Schaeffer Cox. At FBI's direction, Mr. Olson then called Schaeffer Cox and inquired about militia opportunities. And Schaeffer Cox told Mr. Olson, "I'll have Major Barney get in touch with you." And that's what happened. Major Barney called Mr. Olson and invited him to his house on August 11th, 2010 to attend a militia meeting. At that August 11th, 2010 meeting, Schaeffer Cox was there, Coleman Barney was there, Lonnie Vernon was there, and other militia members were there. Mr. Olson took an oath and was commissioned into the militia. And you're going to learn that Mr. Olson was trusted by Schaeffer Cox and quickly brought into his inner circle, in part because they shared this connection through the Montana militia member. When Mr. Olson moved out to Alaska from Montana, he got involved in some criminal activity. And we're not going to ask you to like this guy. He lied, he's cheated, he's stolen, and he's going to tell you all of that himself. When he moved up to Alaska, he was a trucker, and he transported drugs for a drug trafficking organization. He hasn't paid his taxes in years. When he worked as a septic system installer out in the valley, he didn't provide the services he was supposed to, and he was convicted of a felony theft in the 2nd degree and 4 misdemeanor counts for installing uncertified septic systems. When he was on probation for that offense, he was convicted of a felony vehicle theft. And when he was arrested on that charge, he indicated that he was willing to provide information to law enforcement, that he wanted to cooperate with law enforcement on other investigations with the hopes of receiving a reduced sentence in his vehicle theft case, which he did receive. In early 2010, Mr. Olson began working with the Alaska State Troopers and the Drug Enforcement Administration. Then in the summer of 2010, he began working with the FBI. And between July 30th, 2010 and March 10th, 2011, the FBI tasked Mr. Olson in this investigation. And during that period of time, the FBI paid for some of his services and living expenses for Mr. Olson and his family. And when the defendants were arrested on March 10th, 2011, and before Mr. Olson's role as an informant became public, the FBI chose to relocate Mr. Olson and his family. And the total that Mr. Olson and his family received for those moving expenses was $60,000. And Mr. Olson's expecting compensation for his services that he's provided throughout this case. We wouldn't be here today if proof of this case depended on Mr. Olson's words alone. What you're going to hear throughout trial are the defendant's own words. And that's going to be through the recordings, through the witness testimony, through the handwritten documents that the defendants had and their co-conspirators had in their houses and vehicles, and through the electronic information that was stored on their computers and the text messages that they shared. Now, going back to that August 11th, 2010 meeting at Coleman Barney's house, at that meeting, you'll hear Schaeffer Cox describe his belief that there was a plot by the federal government to kill him and his family and to bring the hammer down on his militia. A few months after that meeting, Schaeffer Cox invited Mr. Olson to his home for another meeting. See, Schaeffer Cox had an upcoming hearing in a pending state criminal case, and he was going to appear for a television interview following that court appearance. And he decided that he needed a security detail for his protection. he held a couple meetings in advance to plan for that security detail. And he said that his militia members were going to be armed with hornet's nests and OC and CS gas. And actually, you're going to see those plans yourself because Schaeffer Cox still had the dry erase board in his house. That dry erase board has all the numbers written out for the steps, the plans that they were going to take for that night on November 23rd, 2010. This was all to happen at the television station after the court appearance. This is the King Jesus North Pole station. We call it KJNP. You'll see at the bottom of that dry erase board, they were given two ways to deal with federal interference. First option, hornet's nest, OC gas. Second option, lead poisoning. You're also going to see the handwritten notes that were found in Coleman Barney's house and Lonnie Vernon's house regarding the security detail briefings in anticipation of that night of November 23rd, 2010. And actually, you're going to hear from Coleman Barney himself, because in an earlier court hearing in this case, he testified and he admitted that that night his understanding was that federal agents were going to come for Schaeffer Cox. And he admitted that he was there that night, part of the security detail, and he was armed. He was wearing body armor, and he was armed with his AR-15 semi-automatic assault rifle with a 37mm launcher attached to it, and it was loaded with a hornet's nest round. And he admitted that he was set up on the perimeter that night. He was standing by a tree. Schaeffer Cox was also there that night. He had a loaded pistol on him. Lonnie Vernon was also part of the security detail. He was armed with his semi-automatic assault rifle and decked out in his military gear with his helmet. You'll see a photo. Other militia members were also there that night. They set up a security checkpoint so that they could stop members of the public from coming into that KJNP parking area. And they also set up spotlights in the parking area. You're going to hear from witnesses who work at KJNP who were there that night. Now, after that night of November 23rd, 2010, Schaeffer Cox did appear for his next couple state court hearing dates in December of 2010. You'll hear that after one of those hearings, he told an Alaska state trooper, "We have you outmanned and outgunned and could probably have you all dead in a night." And then Schaeffer Cox decided to organize his own common law jury trial to be held, and it was held, at the Denny's restaurant in Fairbanks. He organized his own common law jury. And actually, before the jury trial at Denny's, he told the jurors how they were supposed to vote. And guess who was on that jury? Coleman Barney and Lonnie Vernon. And guess what their verdict was? They acquitted Schaeffer Cox of the charges pending against him. Well, despite the Denny's common law jury verdict, Cox's state criminal case remained pending. In early February 2011, there was a militia summit held in Anchorage. And Schaeffer Cox asked Lonnie Vernon and Mr. Olson to attend that militia summit on his behalf. And Schaeffer Cox promoted Mr. Olson to the rank of sergeant in order for him to attend this militia summit. Schaeffer Cox instructed Lonnie Vernon and Mr. Olson to purchase grenade bodies from Bill Fulton when they were in Anchorage. Lonnie Vernon and Mr. Olson traveled to Anchorage together, and immediately upon meeting Bill Fulton, Lonnie Vernon asked Bill Fulton if he could purchase grenade bodies from him. Now, at the time, Bill Fulton was a government informant, but none of the defendants knew that, nor even Mr. Olson. Throughout that weekend, Lonnie Vernon and Mr. Olson met with Bill Fulton in his hotel room in Anchorage. and you're going to see video recordings from those meetings. You'll see and hear Lonnie Vernon ask for grenades, 50 grenade fuses, and he whispered that he wanted a silencer. You'll also hear Lonnie Vernon talk about the fact that he already has a fully automatic machine gun and discuss the availability of 50 caliber firearms. When they returned to Fairbanks, Mr. Olson briefed Schaeffer Cox about their trip. One thing about these recordings, during that period of time between July 30th, 2010 and March 10th, 2011, you're going to hear that a few times there were technical malfunctions, where the FBI gave Mr. Olson a recording device that was already full, so it wasn't capable of recording. So even though Mr. Olson thought he was recording a conversation, the device itself wasn't actually able to record. Now, about a week after that trip to Anchorage, there was a meeting. Schaeffer Cox, Coleman Barney, Mr. Olson, and another militia member, Ken Thiesing, all met at Mr. Thiesing's residences. Schaeffer Cox decided that he was not going to appear. He wasn't going to show up for his next state court date upcoming on February 14th. One of the topics of conversation was what to do if Schaeffer Cox got arrested, and what to do if Schaeffer Cox or one of his militia members got killed. And they developed a 2-for-1 plan, that if Schaeffer Cox or one of his militia members were killed, then they would kill 2 people, such as law enforcement and judges, in return. 2 for 1. And you'll see actually in Coleman Barney's notebook, on this last page of one of his notebooks, there's a little bullet point, and it says, Mission 2 for 1. You're going to hear the recording of the meeting. You're going to hear Schaeffer Cox talk about the fact he already has grenades, but he wants grenades with longer delayed fuses. That same day, Schaeffer Cox gave Mr. Olson Michael Anderson's contact information so that Mr. Olson could get the information from Michael Anderson. You're also going to hear that that same day, Schaeffer Cox gave Mr. Olson a handwritten note. And on that note was the name of an Alaska State Trooper and his home address. And Schaeffer Cox indicated that he needed to be added to the list. That same day, Schaeffer Cox showed Mr. Olson on a map where other Alaska State Troopers and a state court judge live. Cox didn't show up for his February 14th state court hearing date. A warrant was issued for his arrest, and he became a fugitive. So what did he do? He needed to go somewhere. He moved in with Lonnie Vernon to hide with Lonnie Vernon and his wife, Karen Vernon. They agreed to have him hide there. And you'll hear recordings of meetings between Mr. Olson and the defendants through mid-February 2011. You'll hear that Lonnie Vernon and his wife, Karen Vernon, also tried to get the information from Michael Anderson, but he wouldn't give it to them. So they were going to try to put the information together themselves. On February 19th, 2011, a meeting was held at Coleman Barney's house. Schaeffer Cox, Coleman Barney, Lonnie Vernon, Karen Vernon, Ken Thiesing, and Mr. Olson were all there. After that meeting, Schaeffer Cox decided that he was going to move in with Coleman Barney. Mr. Olson helped him with that move, and during the drive to Coleman Barney's house, Schaeffer Cox was wearing a ballistic vest with 2 CS grenades strapped to it. When they got to Coleman Barney's house, they had a meeting. Just Schaeffer Cox, Coleman Barney, and Mr. Olson. and they further discussed the 2-for-1 plan. And they decided that they didn't have the manpower yet to pull it off and survive. But what you'll hear are Schaeffer Cox's own words saying that he wasn't going to target women and children, but he wasn't opposed to killing them either. You'll hear Schaeffer Cox say he wasn't opposed to drastic, shocking things like nailing heads to people. And you'll hear Schaeffer Cox talk about hanging a body from a lamppost to deter others. And actually, you're going to hear Lonnie Vernon make that same comment on March 8, 2011. A couple days after that, Schaeffer Cox, Coleman Barney, and Mr. Olson went to one of Schaeffer Cox's rental properties. He had a shed on that property with items in it stored there that he wanted to move. You're going to hear that Schaeffer Cox had a number of firearms, ammunition, and about 8 grenades in that shed. And those items were all placed into Coleman Barney's truck. Schaeffer Cox continued to hide out at Coleman Barney's house, lived with Coleman Barney from February 19th up to the day he was arrested on March 10th, 2011. And you'll hear recordings of Mr. Olson's meetings with them through late February 2011. You'll hear Schaeffer Cox talking about converting his machine gun himself to fully automatic. You'll hear Schaeffer Cox and Coleman Barney talking about making silencers. And actually, you're going to hear from Coleman Barney on March 10th, 2011, tell Mr. Olson how quiet Mr. Cox's silencer is. We're also going to hear Schaeffer Cox talk about the fact he has another rifle and he's trying to get a lower receiver to make that one go fully automatic. While Schaeffer Cox was staying at Coleman Barney's house, Schaeffer Cox and Mr. Olson started talking about a plan to get Schaeffer Cox out of the state of Alaska. At FBI's direction, Mr. Olson told Schaeffer Cox that he could help him get out of the state with a trucker that he knew. Although you're also going to hear Schaeffer Cox say that he was going to return to Alaska and wage guerrilla warfare. At the end of February 2011, at FBI's direction, Mr. Olson asked all 3 defendants whether they were interested in purchasing silencers. Mr. Olson told them that the silencers would be coming from Bill Fulton. And at one point, Schaeffer Cox even represented Mr. Olson even represented to Schaeffer Cox and Coleman Barney that Mr. Fulton was a licensed gun dealer, but that the guns would be sold off the books. All 3 defendants agreed to purchase silencers. To pay for the silencer, Schaeffer Cox agreed to trade items. He agreed to trade one of his semi-automatic assault rifles together with the lower receiver that he thought would make it fully automatic in exchange for this pistol and silencer matched set. At FBI's direction, Mr. Olson also told all 3 defendants that Bill Fulton could provide grenades. Lonnie Vernon said he wanted grenades. Schaeffer Cox said he already had grenades, but he wanted ones with longer delayed fuses. Schaeffer Cox ordered 25 grenades. When Mr. Olson told him that only 8 grenades were available for purchase, Schaeffer Cox agreed to purchase those. At FBI's direction, Mr. Olson arranged to meet with the defendants on March 10, 2011, in order to sell them the silencers and grenades that they had ordered. First, Mr. Olson met with Lonnie Vernon and Karen Vernon the morning of March 10, 2011. Mr. Olson had consented to have the FBI install recording devices in his vehicle. So you're actually going to see video recordings of the weapons deals. Mr. Olson met Lonnie Vernon and Karen Vernon, and they followed him to a prearranged location that was this deserted industrial area near the train tracks in Fairbanks. And they got into Mr. Olson's vehicle. Lonnie Vernon was in the front seat, Karen Vernon in the back seat. Mr. Olson retrieved the pistol and silencer match set and the grenades. He got back into his vehicle and he handed those items to the Vernons. The pistol and silencer match set were in a hard case called a Pelican case. You can see Lonnie Vernon flips it open, he takes out the pistol with the silencer, he examines it, and they pay Mr. Olson cash for those items. After the weapons deal is done, law enforcement arrests Lonnie Vernon and Karen Vernon. Now, the Vernons didn't know it, but at the time, the grenades that they purchased were inert. Those grenades were found in Karen Vernon's purse. The FBI knew what the plan was. They made the plan, and so they made sure that those grenades weren't functioning when they sold them to the Vernons. Lonnie Vernon and Karen Vernon were armed. They were both carrying loaded firearms on their persons when they were arrested. Shortly after that, Mr. Olson met with Schaeffer Cox and Coleman Barney. Schaeffer Cox and Coleman Barney had driven into town that morning and they had pulled Coleman Barney's white utility trailer. They pulled it to the ice park and they left it there. And then they met up with Mr. Olson at the Fred Meyer. Schaeffer Cox and Coleman Barney thought that part of the plan that day was that they were going to meet the trucker who was going to help Schaeffer Cox flee the state. Schaeffer Cox and Coleman Barney got into Mr. Olson's vehicle. Mr. Barney sat in the front seat. Schaeffer Cox sat in the back seat. You're going to hear the recording of their conversation while they drive to that same deserted industrial area. You're going to hear them talking about silencers, the power of silencers. When they get to that location, Mr. Olson again retrieves this time 2 cases with pistol and silencers and the hand grenades. He gets into the vehicle and he hands the Pelican cases, one to Coleman Barney and one to Schaeffer Cox. And you'll see Coleman Barney click open the case. He takes out the pistol with the silencer. He's handling it, examining it. Schaeffer Cox is doing the same thing in the back seat. Then Mr. Olson hands one of the grenades back to Schaeffer Cox. He's examining it. Coleman Barney gets a phone call. He's on the phone. When his phone call ends, Mr. Olson hands Mr. Barney one of the grenades. While Mr. Barney's examining that grenade, Mr. Olson realizes that someone's coming up on them. He sees someone coming up to their vehicle. And you'll hear Mr. Olson on the recording say, "Someone's coming up on us." And you'll see Coleman Barney quickly try to hide the items as best he can. He takes the pistol with the silencer and puts it under his leg. He takes the grenade, puts it under his seat, and then he takes that Pelican case and he quickly shuts it because the outline in the phone still shows the pistol with the silencer. An innocent citizen unexpectedly comes right up to Coleman Barney's window and asks them what they're doing. Why are they there? Because the situation was compromised, because safety was of utmost concern, law enforcement immediately arrested Schaeffer Cox and Coleman Barney. At the time, both of them were wearing body armor. Coleman Barney had $5,000 cash on him. He also had 2 loaded firearms on him, and Schaeffer Cox had a loaded firearm in his pocket. And you're going to see all of this yourself. I've referred to a number of recordings this morning. Don't worry, we're not planning on playing all 100 hours of recordings for you. We and the defense have selected clips and portions of the recordings with Mr. Olson, and we'll play those for you during trial. And those recordings with Mr. Olson, we'll play them in chronological order. Some of them are hard to hear. You'll have transcripts to review as you listen to the recordings, and the court's also have headsets available to help listen as well. We are planning on calling about 70 witnesses in this trial, and we plan to offer approximately 700 exhibits into evidence. And because of the juggling that's required with that number of witnesses coming to Anchorage from a variety of places, the evidence may not always come in a way that immediately makes most sense to you. We're going to do our best to present the evidence in a logical order, but we would request your patience and request that you keep an open mind as we present the evidence. And as I've indicated, the evidence will consist of recordings, witness testimony, documents, other items found in the defendant's houses and vehicles, including that trailer, and electronic information stored in their computers, text messages. You're going to hear the defendant's own words, making plans, negotiating deals for silencers and hand grenades, discussing ways to avoid detection by law enforcement. What you're not going to hear are the defendant's own words saying that they thought any of this was a bad idea or that they shouldn't move forward. Now, at the end of this case, we'll have an opportunity to stand before you again. And at that time, we'll ask you to render the only verdict that's consistent with the evidence in this case. And that's to hold the defendants responsible for their firearms violations, for conspiring to possess unregistered silencers and destructive devices, for conspiring to kill federal officers and employees, for carrying firearms during and in relation to those conspiracies, and for Defendant Cox soliciting others to kill federal officers and employees. Thank you.
Thank you, counsel. Mr. Traverso, do you wish to make an opening statement?